Okay, everybody. Thank you for attending this lecture. My name is Mortaza Hashemi, and I'm director of ICEMiC Research Center. The Amal Treacher Kabesh annual lecture hosted by ICEMiC offers an opportunity to honor the memory of our late colleague and former director of the center. This year, we are fortunate to welcome two distinguished speakers whose contributions we will hear shortly. The plan for today's event is as follows. So after my remarks, we will hear from the head of the discipline's tribute to the memory of Amal, and this will be followed by the joint lecture from our two invited speakers, which will last for 40 minutes, and we will conclude with 20 minutes question and answer. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Nick Stevenson, head of the Sociology discipline in Nottingham, to deliver his reflection on the life, work, and legacy of Amal Treacher Kabesh.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for coming. I think it's always on occasions like this. I was coming in this morning, I started to think, what a shame it is that Amal couldn't be here. I'm sure she'd be absolutely thrilled at the idea of an event like this taking place and it being connected to her and in her honour. I've got no doubt about that. There are lots of other things about Amal which I'm less certain about, but not. And those of you who are laughing have clearly met Amal, but that I'm absolutely sure about. So, thanks very much for coming, and thanks very much to Mortaza for organising today, and thanks for everyone for coming. So, Amal is a very difficult person, I think, to sum up. I think she's a complex human being. On one level, we all are, but Amal is particularly complex, I think. I think mostly me and Amal worked together on a module that we taught at an MA level called Between Europe and the Middle East. And Amal was very keen on working with me. I wasn't so sure because I didn't know her terribly well at that point. And we'd often stand in front of the students at the beginning of the course and say to them, I would say to them, my name's Nick Stevenson, I'm going to be talking about Europe. And Amal would introduce herself and sort of say we're going to talk about the Middle East. And then one year I suddenly started saying, and of course, I don't know anything about the Middle East. And Amal would say, no, he doesn't. But over that time, I did feel that I learned quite a lot from her. The other jokes that she used to tell everybody when she was ever people were visiting and they knew her, and she'd introduce me and say, this is Nick Stevenson, my great friend, she'd always say, Nick Stevenson, and then say, and of course, we agree about absolutely nothing. And inevitably in that joke, some of that is true, perhaps, but then I could never work out exactly what it was we didn't agree about, because we did... Enlightenment. Yes, well, there was that. And the other thing was there was always an exchange going on between the two of us. She would often see me and stop me and say, Nick, I thought about you at the weekend. I put a book in your pigeonhole. You really need to read that. And then I go and find this book and then think, all right, I'm not quite sure why I needed to read that, but all right, I'd read it and I'd say, well, why did I need to read this? I can't remember any of that anymore. For such a complex person, I think that also her writing was very complex. I want to talk a little bit about her writing. That really, it was a kind of meeting point, I would say, between the post-colonial feminism and psychoanalysis. And her writing, which came out of all that kind of encounter, particularly to do with the Egyptian context, but she also wrote about her life in the UK as well, was always a sense of like shifting from one thing to another and then back again. She was very difficult to sort of pin down sort of personally, but also to pin down in terms of which it was always writing in movement. I often used to think she would be sort of settled somewhere. The other thing about Amal was she was someone who I mean, it's interesting what she said about me and her never agreeing about anything. With my relationship with her, I don't know what she was like with other people, is she invited disagreement. She liked it. She liked to be in disagreement with you. I noticed that to some extent that ethic has kind of gone out of the profession somewhere. People are a little bit frightened, I think, of disagreement now. Mel was never very worried about that. I think that she was often more worried about agreeing with you than disagreeing with you. So I think if we were going to sort of remember or honour her today, I think that there's three things I think I'd want to bring together, really, which I'm hopefully we'll see in the seminar and in our discussions about it. Was firstly this thing about complexity, which is there in her writing, this moving between different points of view, moving between different sort of literatures. Secondly, this thing about dialogue, because she loved to talk, she loved dialogue, she loved to, kind of ask you questions and be thoughtful and so on. And the third, to kind of welcome in disagreement, I think, not to be afraid of it, and hopefully we'll carry on that spirit today. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you for that brilliant tribute to Amal, Nick. I should now introduce our two speakers. Dr. Lucy Mayblin is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Sheffield and co-director of the Migration Research Group. She is a leading political sociologist whose work and research focuses on borders, human rights, colonial legacies, and asylum policy. She is the author of several award-winning books, including Asylum After Empire, and has played a major role in advancing post-colonial approaches to migration studies in the UK. Our second speaker, Dr. Tesfalem Yemane, is a research fellow at the University of Liverpool, whose work spans the politics of migration control, critical refugee studies, and post-colonial approaches to forced migration. His research draws on extensive academic and professional experience across Eritrea, Sudan, China, and the UK, including doctoral work examining the experiences of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers in the United Kingdom. So, please.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and what a wonderful introduction, and we do indeed wish that she was here to have disagreement with us. So as you can see from this slide, there's a lot of people involved in this research we're talking about, and it's the first time we've talked about it, so we don't know how it's going to go, but hopefully okay. Can you change the slide, please? So this is a talk about channel crossings, small boat channel crossings, and what we call in the UK the English Channel is this short body of water between the UK and France. It's been a place where refugees have crossed for hundreds and hundreds of years, at least. But since the 1990s, when refugees fleeing the Yugoslav war started to congregate around Calais in the hope of travelling to the UK, and especially after the Channel Tunnel opened in 1994, it's become a site of intense border fortification. And I should have said also at the beginning, one of our team members, Tom Davis, works here at Nottingham. Probably you are familiar with him, with his work, and he has done a lot of work in Calais over the years. So people started crossing this body of water most recently in small boats. There's a longer history of small boat crossings, but as in the kind of recent history, people had previously crossed mainly in lorries, and they started crossing in small boats in 2018. And this happened primarily because it had become so difficult to cross by stowing away in lorries and other vehicles. And that was due to 30 years of consistently intensifying border security and fortification around the port of Calais. Can you change the slide, please? So on this slide, you can see, if you look closely, the dates 2001, 2014, 2025. So this isn't a new issue, clandestine, irregularised crossings. But with the pandemic, when freight and all other types of vehicle transport across the channel halted, small boats had been a small number from 2018 and really became the main route after the pandemic. So 37,000 people crossed in this way last year. And the vast majority of people who cross make an application for asylum in the UK, They have higher recognition rates than people arriving by other routes. But it is important to say that proportionately there aren't more people crossing the channel than there were a few years ago, just that they're now extremely much more visible than they were. And they're also potentially much more disruptive to the flow of capital and goods and labour and tourists than they were when they were stowing away in lorries. As, of course, with other, just like in other border zones around the world, this has been very fertile terrain for politicians across the political spectrum seeking to present the movement of people as a crisis, a migrant crisis. And successive governments in the UK, as you're probably aware, have proposed and introduced ever more authoritarian solutions to stop the boats and bring order to the border. So the scale of suffering created by those policies can't be underestimated. Over 400 people have been killed in this border zone since 1999, but more than 200 of those have been since 2018. And every year the number of deaths increases, even though many of them are not recorded. It's hard to get numbers and they're not always recorded. French journalists have called this border a silent serial killer. But of course the harm of the border goes beyond deaths. Recent policies under the last Conservative government included not processing people's asylum claims, which led to the backlog and the hotel crisis, forcing people to live in cramped and overcrowded conditions in hotels, a barge and army barracks, and living under the threat of detention and deportation to Rwanda. The Labour government cancelled the Rwanda plan, but have been sending people back to France and curtailing the rights and entitlements of people who seek asylum in the UK, even people recognised as refugees, as well as talking a lot about efforts to smash the gangs who facilitate the movement. Increasingly, people moving across the channel are criminalised not only just for entering, but also facilitating the movement of others. So photographed by drones and then accused of being smugglers themselves. So in 2022-23 alone, 185 people who wanted to claim asylum have been imprisoned under people smuggling laws and cannot apply for asylum in the UK. Can you change the slide, please? So the research that we're talking about today is from an ESRC project, which is about UK responses to small boat channel crossings. We did a lot of things in this project. We did policy discourse analysis of over 400 texts. We interviewed politicians and policymakers. We did interviews and workshops with people in civil society who've been resisting the government policy approach. We've investigated the private companies who are delivering border security services. And finally, we have interviewed people who have crossed the channel irregularly. So the paper that we're presenting today focuses on this last bit of the work, on interviews with people who have crossed. And the channel, like many other contexts around the world, is not only fortified by all of the things that we might know, like walls and fences and guards and drones and AI systems, etc., but also through knowledge claims about human mobility. For example, government ministers consistently represent refugees as criminal, illegal immigrants breaking into Britain, and they represent smugglers as causing rather than facilitating cross-border movement. Can you change the slide, please? So using work already done by our team members and primarily by Tom, who couldn't be here today because he's got a hospital appointment, but we are conceptualizing these types of claims, these knowledge claims about the border, as epistemic border work. So it's work which serves to fortify the border or justify border fortification. Epistemic border work, we think, serves to amplify perspectives which are consistent with state interests and policy agendas, while silencing unwanted voices and shutting out perspectives that expose the injustice of the border itself. Epistemic border work serves to present a narrative about channel crossings in which a set of truth claims are made completely self-evident. So they include that France is a safe country, that people who seek to cross have no logical reason to do so. They are in fact actually criminals. Smugglers are evil and profit from human misery. States have a moral obligation to intervene to save refugees from smugglers. Smuggling is the driver of irregular migration, and criminal justice solutions and fortified borders are the solution and will stop the crossings. And we framed these kind of accounts in other parts of our work that we've published as fantasies. Others have written about them as spectacles and discourses of risk centering threats to the state. But alongside the literature that exists kind of critiquing those policies, the less heard and unwanted voices in the picture present different accounts. And those accounts might be academic accounts, but also aid worker accounts, activist accounts, journalistic, left-wing journalistic accounts, but most centrally kind of counter-knowledges of the border relate to the narratives of people who have crossed the channel by small boat. Can you change the slide, please? So in this paper, we wanted to explore these counter-knowledges of the border from the perspective of those who have crossed the channel in small boats and some in lorries. And what's most immediately obvious from this is that recognising this knowledge presents a completely different reality than that which I just described, that political elites and policymakers present. So in this account, France emerges as a dangerous country for people of in precarious immigration status. People seeking to travel to Britain to claim asylum have no choice but to cross irregularly. They're seeking asylum from tyranny and conflict. Smugglers, who are called facilitators, in other words, by our participants, provide a service to cross in the absence of more safe and desirable alternatives, though that's not to say they're the good guys. And criminal justice solutions and fortified borders are the cause of small boat channel crossings and related deaths, not a means of stopping them. So I'm going to pass to Tesfalem now to talk about our methods and our conceptual framework.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Can I have the next slide, please? So thank you. So I'll just briefly be talking about our methodology and methods in terms of how we gather data and who we involved in gathering the data. So just maybe to give you a bit of a context of the demographic of the research participants. So we conducted 39 interviews with refugees and people seeking asylum in the UK. In terms of the demography, it was with the age bracket of 19 to 50 years old, 35 male and 4 female participants. You can see the proportion of the gender proportion in terms of the demography. It was people from Afghanistan, Eritrea, country which I am from, Sudan, Iran, Pakistan, Egypt and Kuwait. So in terms of the representation of the geographic routes of migration, Africa, Eritrea, for example, the Horn of Africa region, the East of Africa region, the Sahara Desert, Libya, the Mediterranean Sea and Europe. But we have also Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Greece and Europe, the Middle East. So it covers a wide range of geographies in terms of the migration journeys and experiences across different border lands. In terms of the methods of crossing the channel, as Lucy said, despite the political and media, especially from some media sections in the UK, despite that hyper visibility of the boat, the small boat as a crisis, as the definition of the crisis across the border, actually what we found was a third of the research participants, which is 13 of them actually crossed the UK using lorries. So 26 came with small boats, but 13 also used the lorries. So people talk about different reasons why the small boats and why the lorries. People talked about the prices, the affordability, but also the lorries being very dangerous, but also the lorries, using the lorry becoming very, very difficult because of the tapestry of border infrastructure in Calais, different modern technology bordering infrastructure that made it very, very difficult for people to use lorries, for example, like using sniffer dogs, using modern technology, imagery skills, which make for people very, very difficult to get past the border infrastructures. We conducted 6 interviews in Farsi, 12 in Arabic, 9 in Tigrinya, a language that I speak, 2 in Bilen, again another language and spoken in Eritrea, 5 in Pashto, 4 in Kurdish, and 1 in English. So this is just a general overview of the research participants and then the linguistic diversity and then the country of origin. Can we have the next slide, please? So in terms of collecting the data, we worked with 5 research assistants. So we recruited research assistants, and then I will talk in a minute about why we call them research assistants. And myself as a postdoc in the project, again with a refugee background. So all researchers, myself included, had lived experience of forced migration. They also had extensive work experience in the UK refugee and migrant sector. They were very active community organizers as well. They were embedded in the communities, but also they were very active voices in the sector, in policy, frontline work. 3 of them were also doctoral researchers. So the recruitment combined 3 experiences and expertise. So they were expertise in their own right, actually. So they were very, very an integral part of the process from the beginning in terms of how we designed the methodology and the methods together. There was a very dialogical, interactive process. It was not just bringing them, recruiting them, just using them to extract and hunt data because of their linguistic and social connections. They were very much part of the design process in terms of designing the interview guides, translating them into different languages, developing the interview guides, preparing and debriefing materials that we were given to research participants, translating and transcribing, so simultaneous translation and transcription of the interviews from the different languages into English, developing a coding framework. So we developed the coding framework together. I did the coding, the manual coding, the actual coding, but we developed the coding together. So it was, as you saw in the first slide, the team together, we deliberated. We had 2 debriefing discussions where we talked about the emerging patterns of the teams, and then I did the coding. So they were an integral part of the process from the beginning to the end. They are still part of the writing process as well. So as you can see in this, but also other publication in the book and other articles that we're hoping to develop, they are still very much part of the project. They had a very active role in writing and giving comments to our publications. They also translated the most important documents, the participatory information sheet, the consent forms. So we have fully recognized their authorial voices. We did not just recruit them as data gatherers, as data producers. We recruited them as thought leaders and expertise in their own right. We called them research assistants. We didn't give them different levels, like sometimes in the research, we often use peer researchers, refugee researchers, community researchers. So we were very cautious of that. We didn't want to impose a label on them. So we discussed it, we deliberated together, and we went by the job title that they were comfortable with. So they owned the job title, because we didn't want to give them refugee researchers, because it's in a way symbolically can be a bit exclusive. They were an integral part of the team. So we went with the refugee research assistant's job title. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. So this is as Lucy explained it. What we want to do in this article is, of course, build on the idea of epistemic border work and bring that into dialogue with Medina's concept of epistemic friction, which is then answering back, researching from below, as opposed to the dominant knowledge structures, to the dominant knowledge frameworks that are designed to serve the dominant and hegemonic knowledge productions, but also the dominant discourses that are designed to legitimate, to justify very, very violent border and bordering practices. So what we try to do in that then, to bring knowledge from the margins, to bring voices from the margins, to bring knowledge, to produce knowledge from the actual voices, from the lived experiences of people who we interview. So Medina, in his work, in the context of the historic racist lynchings in the US, talks about what he calls epistemic friction, and he writes, there are epistemic distortions that render the phenomenon of racial violence relatively invisible or excusable as an avoidable aspect of social reality. What he says is some theoretical and epistemological propositions naturalize violence by way of masking, by way of silencing the actual lived experiences of the other. So we hope to use his idea of epistemic friction in this article, and by creating that, therefore, we turn the spectacle against itself and forcing viewers to inhabit differently, critically, forcing people to step out of the perspective, the main dominant perspective of the mere spectator, and see the other, and listen to the other, hear the other knowledge, the other perspective, the other voices. In a way, what the idea of epistemic friction helps us is, it helps us resist, contest, and disrupt the hegemonic knowledge orders and knowledge frameworks. And we also build on the Genevas and Schill's idea of the autonomy of migration. Migrants and refugees having the agentive capacity, the reason, the knowledge, the ways of negotiating the borders, but their forms of knowledge would help them find cracks within the broader macrostructural bordering projects that are designed to immobilize and warehouse them in different necropolitical borderlands. So we hope this helps us then to recover the effaced, the masked refugee agencies in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their skills, in terms of their reason. As Lucy said, what the hegemonic knowledge production and frameworks does is really frame and characterize refugees in the litany of lacks and deficiencies. They don't have reason, and this is why they are governed by these impulsive reasons that sometimes they just jump into the sea. We want to disrupt that, we want to contest that, we want to produce, we hope we are producing a counter-hegemonic knowledge. So what kind of knowledge is lived experiences in this context? It's a form of a racialized knowledge and it's a subordinated experience. So the next step, I will invite, I think, Lucy to talk about the actual empirical experiences of the research participants in northern France. What were the experiences on land?
Yeah, okay, and then you'll do the sea.
Then I'll do the sea, yeah.
Okay, so Tesfalem's talked a lot about knowledge, and one of the most striking things of the narratives is just the absolute depth of knowledge and expertise that people need to acquire in order to move across borders, as well as, of course, resources. So that includes knowledge of routes, of prices, of how to navigate and arrange them.
Yeah, next slide.
Of options, of geographies, of shipping routes, of policy, of law, of languages, of weather, of seamanship, of swimming, of life-saving, wound care, camping, knowledge of death and surviving. So in other words, a vast pool of knowledge. And this is collectively held and collaboratively shared, but sometimes, of course, it comes with a price tag. And so the ways that people gain knowledge is from friends, from social media, but particularly from people popularly known as smugglers, but referred to by our participants as agents, brokers, mediators, or facilitators, and we'll use facilitators here. And some knowledge, of course, gained through lived experience in different border zones. So we found that the most trusted sources of knowledge, of information about crossing this border in northern France are families and friends, and most especially facilitators. Facilitators might not always be trustworthy, but they're important sources of information. And I think this is important because while epistemic border work entails representing facilitators as just pure evil and a danger to people on the move, it was agents of the state actually police or border guards who were understood to be the main source of repression and violence amongst people that we spoke to, left with no choice for safe routes to travel to the UK, many people reluctantly put their trust in facilitators with their money, huge amounts of money, but also their lives. And the idea of the facilitators as the holders of key knowledge was central to this. So for some, trust was built through discussions with others who'd been in the area for much longer and developed a relationship with facilitators. And for some people, this was trust built through living with facilitators, usually other irregularised people who were temporarily working to fund the next stage of their journey, and having long discussions, interrogations of them about the journey ahead. For example, Amir explained his experience of Calais. He said the mediator himself may be one of the guys who lives with you, maybe a national or any other nationals who stay in Calais. He lives in the same situation as you live in, and gives you full details about the means and quality of rubber boats. I've received information regarding when you can choose a suitable time and the weather and the sea waves, which height of waves. If it's more than 70 centimetres, the mediator won't allow you to go. So some participants expressed actually deep trust in the facilitators as the only people who had the correct and reliable information that they'd need to succeed in crossing the channel. In other words, counter-knowledge of the border held very strong epistemic value, and this extended to providing information about the UK, though how reliable, we don't know. As Rashid explained, I don't know much about that, but how to cross the border. Not much about how to cross the border, but my friend told me how they crossed the border, and they introduced me to the agents. They told me how the UK is better than France. They're very aware of many things. We had to follow the agent only. They know how to cross the sea, and from where they will arrange a boat from us. Those agents helped with everything. They know about the routes and police too. So Rashid shares the fact that the agents have all of the information and help with everything, but it did, we should note, take him 9 months of attempted crossings to be successful, and his in-laws made the payment, which was a huge amount, he said, thousands of euros. The slide, please. Some participants trusted the facilitators in Calais because they perceived them to be much more professionalised and reliable and less prone to violence than those in other border zones. Malake explained his experience. He said, yes, they're very different from the previous ones. When you get to Dunkirk, the agents themselves approach and ask you if you need their service. They're easily available like an open market. You try to make a deal and would ask them if their service is guaranteed. They try to reassure you that the deal is until you get to the UK, and if you decide to stop, they'll refund your payment. You pay first and you try as many times as you can until you get to the UK. They told us they can refund our payments if we decide to stop for any reason, and the deal was guaranteed compared to the previous ones in other border zones. So here we can see that the facilitators aren't actually understood by people who wish to cross the channel as evil people holding them at gunpoint onto boats. They're understood as people who have vital knowledge and the means to facilitate a very dangerous crossing. People aren't naive about the dangers, and business people providing a service. And this representations of facilitators is surprising, perhaps, and clearly in tension with the epistemic border work of states. And putting the two side by side creates a friction where the role of the evil smuggler and the moral state thwarting their efforts isn't any longer settled, but maybe rendered more complex or even untrue. So the UK's border with France in and around Calais was actually the final border, as Tesfalem mentioned earlier, in many border crossings. And this means that people approached it already completely exhausted, with a raft of traumatic experiences behind them and the mental and physical wounds to show for them. They'd known danger, and to know this border was to encounter more danger and more fear. Can I have the next slide, please? So Arsam articulated this succinctly, saying the only reason for my journey was the presence of my family in the UK. If you're asking about the effect of these experiences on a person during such a journey, I would say you face death thousands of times along the way. You experience poverty, hunger, sleeping in forests, and witnessing how the police in most of these countries that claim to uphold human rights, treat you. Rashid explained how some people tried to cross the border by hiding in containers or lorries, but a lorry is way more dangerous than a boat. People die of suffocation. Others pointed out that it had become almost impossible to cross because of this way, because of the security measures, as Tesfalem mentioned. And the other option was to travel as a tourist on a ferry, which was by far the most expensive service and required months of waiting for all of the documents to be set up. But the idea of the sea crossing, as well as the lorry crossing, but not to underestimate how terrifying it was for people. Hamdan explained that on his successful crossing there were 60 people who went down to the beach, but some people were so scared they went back to the camps. He said they were scared of the sea and that the French police might come and rip the boat. Milad had a similar level of fear of the boat route, but explained that he couldn't afford another route, and he was even more scared of the truck route than the small boat route. So the sea was the only option left. I had no other hope, he said. These days, when I think back to that journey, I have no idea how I made it through. At any moment, you could lose your life, never see your family again, and all your hopes would be destroyed. So everybody spoke of making multiple attempts, 8 to 10 attempts to cross, and of living in precarious informal camps in extreme weather conditions under constant pressure from the French police for months or sometimes years. Refugee knowledge of this border zone is the knowledge that it's formed of structural violence and an absence of human rights. And understanding this means that the greatest risks on land in northern France don't come from the facilitators, but from the state authority representatives like the police. And in this context, exhaustion was one of the main lived experiences of preparing to try to cross the channel. Everybody spoke about how the French police demolished your camps or ripped up your tents on a regular basis, using exhaustion as an insidious tactic to wear you down and make you leave. One participant said that when they returned to their camp after a police raid, the trees that they'd been camping amongst so that their tents would be hidden had been deforested, a practice that's been widely reported by activists working in the area. And sometimes the raids involved physical violence if people were present when the raid happened. So Aaron explained this constant upheaval caused immense challenges and left us frustrated due to the discriminatory practices of the police towards us. I mean, discriminatory really downplays it. Sometimes they even forced us out of our tents during rainstorms, demonstrating a lack of sympathy for migrants in their actions. The French police used tear gas and struck people with batons, and some people ended up disabled. The centrality of fear in this experience of the border is important to draw attention to, because the epistemic border work of the state involves representing people crossing the channel as people without normal emotions, as well as not being rational. They're breaking into Britain or swarming or flooding, not normal people who are just cold and afraid and deserving of respect and holding rights. And this dehumanization is one of the ways in which their suffering can be ignored, enabled, or accelerated, and it is, amongst other things, an epistemic injustice. But by foregrounding their accounts, we create a friction with the dominant representations. Most of this very legitimate fear related to fear of the authorities, and the two things, fear of the crossing and fear of the authorities, were intertwined with each other since the police thwarted people's efforts to get on the boats by slashing them. And this led to very chaotic, increasingly chaotic embarkations and near-death experiences. And the intensity of the memories of those experiences was evident in the kind of details people recalled, as though the fear had heightened their senses and laid down really clear memories. Like years after crossing, they volunteered times and dates of multiple different attempts, the time of arrival in the UK, the number of people in the boat, just incredible levels of detail. And can I have the next slide, please? And Aaron vividly described the multiple layers of fear from his time in Calais. He said the challenges we faced were immense. The agents, often Arabs, recruited individuals like us living in tents with little money to act as facilitators. Our nightly attempts were relentless. However, danger lurked. Sometimes police drones tracked our movements, signalling the authorities. We spent the remaining hours of each night evading the police with vigilant dogs. This routine persisted for several nights. Our path led through thickets and bushes, carrying the dingy plastic boats towards the seaside, and the risk was palpable. the spiky branches threaten to puncture our flimsy vessels, potentially deflating them in the middle of the treacherous sea. Okay, and I will pass now to Tesfalem to talk about the experiences of crossing the sea.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucy. So this is the experiences of crossing the sea, starting even from the coastline. So, as Lucy has explained, the sea is they hope it's the last leg of the different experiences across different borderlands, the last leg of the exhaustive experiences across the different transit countries and borderlands. But what we learned from this project is actually it's not. And the experiences of crossing the sea, as Lucy said, it's another addition of exhaustion. It's the emotional exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty whether someone is going to make it alive and safe to the UK. That level of exhaustion, but that level of attrition as well with the police, as Lucy was saying. There's always these hide and seek games with the police, with the emotional questions, with the fear, with the anxiety, with the hope. Then the police would come and slash the dinghies, and then they will go back, stay there, so don't know how long. So the exhaustion was there. The fear of this, the fear of crossing the sea, the fear of being intercepted by the French police, the multiple attempts. And the attrition, with the attempts, it was not only even the number, it was not, there was money there, there was resources there was the emotional preparation, someone hoping to make it, but then they will be intercepted, they will be taken back. So the emotional dimension of the many failed attempts, sometimes people were telling us they made like 8 to 10, sometimes 12 failed attempts. So I made it on the 7th attempt, I made it on the 6th attempt, I made it on the 10th attempt. What form of dignitary harm does it incur on someone who makes those attempts? It's not only like a physical normal attempt. There's a lot of communications. There's a lot of emotional processes that people go, and people contacting friends, contacting people in the diaspora, in the UK, in different countries. I'm trying, pray for me, but then for them to be intercepted and taken back. So the emotional toll of the exhaustion at the line, at the coast is very, very paramount, and it's very significant. What we saw is actually how exhaustion can be used as a modality of punishment, as a modality of harm in terms of how it impacts people. The fear of failure, the waiting. When am I going to make it? Am I going to wait for 2 years? Am I going to wait for 6 months? How long am I going to wait in these difficult circumstances in northern France? And the weight of failures. And the haunting memories were also. When we were conducting the interviews here, people were like, I didn't know how we made it. I didn't know, we were numb to the emotions. I didn't know if I would be able to go through that process and the experience again. So something really, really dramatic and radical sticks with them. So the hopes, but also the hopes and the prayers, you can see in the face of death, hope also becomes a steel that strengthens the self. And the prayers define resignation, define that we're not going to die, we're going to make it. So the combination of hope, the combination of prayers in the face of death, in the face of fear and the uncertainty, were some of the emotional and affective dimensions of crossing and preparing to cross the sea. Can we have this next slides, please? Yes. So as you can see from, there's some of the examples that we got. For example, Sognat, one of the participants, said, I was absolutely terrified of that road, the sea. The thought of crossing in a rubber boat was extremely frightening. And Khan says water was coming into the boat at a very high speed. Our boat started sinking into the sea. That time we were scared to death. We were thinking that was the end of it. We were dying. But again, the prayer is also there. We're not dying. We're hanging to hope. We're hanging to life. We're not dying. I swear, I sat down and thought it was over. I mean, Allah knows I was scared. That was Hamdan, one of the participants. And Karim said, that time I saw them standing in front of me. This is when they were inside the sea. So sometimes the boats start getting water starts sinking, getting into their boats. And there were also other experiences from Sognat, for example, as you can see, Khan, said water was coming. It has high pressure, and our boat had started sinking to the sea. We were almost in the water when the UK police came there. As Lucy said, because of the geopolitical and the economic importance of the channel the English Channel, there is also this political imperative to have this seamless transition of goods and capital. So there is the geographic proximity of this. Sometimes there is an irony to that. People would be saved. They would not be let to die there. So they were saved, but the fear that they had is very palpable. So at that time we were scared to death. We were thinking that it was the end. We were frozen to death. I was not able to even feel my legs at all, because half my body was in cold sea water. And he says, recounted, when we went to the water, I was scared and kept praying to protect the water. The water was very rough, and when you enter the sea, you don't know if you will survive or not. Similarly, Karim also shared the same experiences. Their boat lost direction when they got into the sea. The person steering the boat was clearly scared, and the other person just panicked. So they were shouting at them. He said, that time I saw them standing in front of me as he was trying to stabilize the boat. So that's the person who was steering the boat. He was reciting the Quranic verses, and I knew it is the end now. The boat front was upward towards the sky, and there was so many people in the boat. Can we have the next slide? And then some of the memories, as we were saying, people telling us, I was scared, but I didn't even know. Upon reflection now, I didn't know how we made it. We could have died. Our hopes could have been ended, as you can see from Milad's experience, for example. These days, when I think back to that journey, I have no idea how I made it through. At any moment, you could lose your life, never see your family again, and all your hopes could be destroyed. And similarly, Subhan also shared the same experiences. Many people had experiences both sinking and near drownings. So that then they say, this still remains with me. I have still these haunting memories that are still stuck with me, seeing people to die, seeing people near death, escape death. Some of these were very close to shore, some out of a sea. So Subhan shared how off the coast of Dunkirk, when we were traveling by boat, the police chased us and threw a net on us so that we couldn't escape. They ruptured our boat with the knives as well, and we were about to drown in the sea. Women and children were crying with fear, and I got injured on that trip too. So they still carry those memories, those scars with them in the UK. For some, for example, for one of the participants called Malake, and again, as Lucy was saying, given the experiences across different borders, including the Mediterranean Sea, including crossing the Deadly Sea, the wastelands of the Sahara Desert, for example, crossing the channel was comparatively easy. But we're not in no way trying to flatten how dangerous and how deadly it could be. It's just testament that they come carrying very, very difficult and violent experiences, crossing, navigating very deadly borderlands. So Malako, for example, from Eritrea, went to Sudan, Sahara Desert, and Libya, and the Mediterranean Sea, that blue killer in there. So he was saying, compared to crossing the Mediterranean Sea, crossing the channel, the English Channel was relatively easy, but it was not in a way undermining and downplaying the how deadly it could be. It just shows how difficult and brutal border regimes they also negotiate during their journeys. And yeah, so upon arrival, so it was mostly this Dover. What were your experiences? Oh, relief, sense of safety, sense of hope, but sense of confusion and disorientation. What next? I didn't know what was happening. They just took us to this place, but I didn't know what happened next. So there was this mixed emotions of sight of relief, hope, safety, but confusion and disorientation. And what awaits them is, as Lucy's work has demonstrated, the hostile asylum system, which we did not examine, of course, in the project. So now
Okay.
hand over to Lucy for
Are we okay for time? How are we for time? I'm just going to conclude.
5 minutes, yeah?
Yeah. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so dominant representations that we all see all the time of people crossing the channel in small boats generally cast them as dangerous or stupid or different kinds of combinations of things. And the archetypes of evil smugglers or traffickers, those words are used interchangeably often, and the criminal illegal immigrant, perhaps sometimes with women and children, innocent victims, and then the saviour state who will protect everybody from the evil smuggler traffickers, are represented as the key players engaged in a kind of just battle for border control. And I think counter-narratives, as we talked about at the beginning, are generally ignored and silenced in those accounts. So irregularised channel crossers aren't represented as people with like really important knowledge of this border because of their social position, not as credible people unless perhaps what they say conforms to state narratives. There was a case of Robert Jenrick going to visit people to collect narratives to support his agenda. But in many cases, people aren't represented as people that know about the border and could contribute to our collective understanding. And as we said, we see this as part of a phenomenon of racialised border violence, which is rendered invisible, unavoidable, or perhaps excusable. And in order to achieve this, the knowledge and experience and agency of people who are on the move wanting to cross the channel is diminished. But the value of this learned and embodied experience isn't only about just understanding people's points of view and understanding their actions, it's about learning from that knowledge. So as I mentioned at the beginning, and I won't read this all out again, but the way that we would understand what is happening in this border zone is completely flipped on its head if we take account of this knowledge. And so what do we do with these two completely opposite understandings from different positions of power? Medina writes that in cases of structural racial violence, the activism that's needed is epistemic activism. That is activism that can wake people up, to quote him, from their epistemic slumbers and call attention to how they're complicit with the vulnerabilities of violence that can that might disrupt their complicity. And we hope that what this research shows is the need for more friction in public debate on small boat channel crossings in the UK and other borders around the world, with the knowledge of people who have crossed at the centre of the discussion.